For railway enthusiasts the world over, the narrow-gauge Austrian Wackelstein Railway is of immediate interest. This is because it still has its original steam power that operates through the most scenic of landscapes. The rugged and lonely terrain of forests and marshland is due to the high rainfall. The region is filled by large rocks of granite, known locally as Wackelstein, that give the region a mystical air. Though highly scenic, these rocks were considered a nightmare, being major obstacles in the building of the line. Today we see the line winding from Altnagelberg through deep forests, passing a recently built station, until it reaches Langegg. It continues on over the only bridge at Alfang, reaching its final destination at Heidenreichstein. 130 years ago, Austria was the centre of the powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the Waldviertel area being just a small part of it. However, development of the railway meant the emperor could construct transportation lines throughout the land. 1870 saw the first connection to the region. The Kaiser Franz Joseph's railway connected the capital of the empire, Vienna, with the Waldviertel area, but there were still parts of the region that remained cut off, and it was recognized that a local railway route was essential. Due to the high cost of railway construction and to minimize outlay, local industrialists decided to build a private narrow-gauge railway of only 2 feet 7 inches or 790 millimeters. This stretch from Gmund to Litschau is the main portion of the route. However, when you reach Altnagelberg, the halfway point to Heidenreichstein, another side route begins, which is the link to the other rail networks. Heidenreichstein is considered to be the home station. It's also the main depot for rolling stock, and where the steam engine of the Wackelstein Express is prepared for its 9-mile, 1-hour-long journey. Before the journey, the engine must be preheated, which in summer is done outside the shed. In winter it can take several hours inside to preheat the engine and avoid any steam pipes cracking. The warming begins the day before the journey. Wood, paper and small pieces of coal are placed in the fire oven. A bit of cloth dipped in fuel is used to light the wood. Although the water level indicator is protected to prevent freezing, during the operation the engineer keeps an eye on it to ensure that enough water is in the tank to prevent damage to the engine. The coal used today comes from the Czech Republic and is especially for use in steam engines. Until recently, the engine was fired by ordinary hard coal, of the kind used for heating homes. However, because this coal did not burn completely to ash, it would drop through the fire grid and set parts of the track alight. Here, a new coal loading platform is being built. When it's completed, the coal will be able to slide directly into the engine's coal box, eliminating the tiresome procedure of shoveling. The engine is now moving to take up position to collect its rolling stock. Following the celebratory tradition for the start of the forthcoming train journey, the sounds of a musician can be heard, entertaining passengers. From Heidenreichstein to Altner-Gelberg, the engine operates in reverse, due to the fact that the line has no means of turning the engine. This special engine was originally constructed for industrial use, and as such does not fit the carriage's coupling heights. That's why it's necessary to use a self-made iron bar to counteract the different coupling heights of the rolling stock. Very close to Litschau is the engine shed. Originally designed for preheating the engine, it now serves as a maintenance workshop and is run by the Railways Association. Responsible for the Railway's public relations is local chemist and secretary of the association, Gerhard Urban. The workshop is responsible for all maintenance, from repairing goods wagons to restoring the leather seating. The association obtains its money from donations provided by local companies, as well as from its membership fee. Unfortunately, ticket fares alone are insufficient to meet the major operating costs, as a round-trip ticket charge is only $7. Our journey commences at Altnagelberg and follows the original route. In July 1899, the recently founded Lower Austrian Railway of the Val de Viertel gathered. The shareholders of this group were the industrialists and entrepreneurs who needed the railway line to connect with other railway networks. Though the group was made up of owners of sawmills and banks, major interest was shown by Mr. Ludwig Stolzer, a local industrialist and owner of a well-known glass firm in Altnagelberg. Glass production had long been a tradition here due to the availability of forests and the plentiful supplies of spruce woods necessary for its production. Stolzer, who had served as a vice-president for the railway, was its major shareholder and maintained an extremely powerful influence on all local railway issues. His glass empire at the time employed more than 3,500 people. The products were sold throughout Europe, the Orient, Australia, and the United States. For Stolzer, the railway line was essential for exporting his products, as well as importing raw materials, and the main reason why he built a side route to his factory. The side route in question begins at a point near to the Altnagelberg station and continues in a sharp, wide bend behind the glass factory. Here the tracks lead directly to the factory's loading platform. When it was built, an entire hill had to be removed. However, the hill turned out to be a massive chunk of granite, and blasting it away became extremely expensive. It was not long after this that the factory closed, and though it continued to fight a court case over the situation until the 1980s, the tracks have long since been dismantled and the loading platform is in disrepair. It should be remembered that when the railway was at its peak, the side route was built within a total of 15 months, and 4 tracks passed through Altnagelberg station. Today the station consists only of the main building, loading platform and freight house. At the end of the station there is still a water supply building with water level indicator and engine filling spout. Although the railway is operated by the association, the station is owned by the state railways, who regretfully do not allow the association access to the station grounds. This resulted in the association having to build a new and costly station a short distance down the line. It also built an additional 20 metres of track to ensure the engine could be moved to either end of the train. The carriages have to be moved by hand for a few metres to allow space for the engine to rejoin the train. To Today, the main route from Gmund to Lützow is operated by the state-owned railways. However, the side route that splits from the main line and heads to Heiden-Reichstein is run by members of the association. Unfortunately, the tracks have to be rented from the Austrian Federal Railways at approximately £100 per month. This is quite a drain on the association's resources, given they are also responsible for all the maintenance costs.
Ja, kom maar.
Some of the very few who devote much of their spare time to keeping this railway alive are Wilhelm Oertel and Manfred Schwingenschlögl. Manfred is, in addition to his job as conductor at the Franz Joseph Bahns Railway, also responsible for the maintenance of the track. Wilhelm Oertel is an engineer and one of those very rare individuals who is allowed to drive all types of engine. During the week, he works for the Austrian Federal Railways. The original 171 engine was to be a narrow gauge of between 790 and 900 millimetres. It was intended to become a top seller for the industrial local railways. Initially commissioned to be built by a steel factory, economic problems meant final construction was by a Viennese engine manufacturer. The engine you see here is a 1938 prototype, numbered 3150. It has an axle weight of 10 tons, a gauge of 790 millimetres, and a power output of 170 horsepower. Unfortunately, the critical situation of the economy at the time meant the engine was never built as a production series. During the Second World War, the occupation of Austria by Nazi Germany required that all construction be turned towards a Nazi victory. This resulted in the steel factory being renamed the Hermann Göring Werk. However, with Hitler demanding machinery for his death campaigns, the factory's board of directors had little choice but to use the steam engine. When the war finished, number 171 was left rusting for many years. In 1991, the engine was found and brought to the factory at Stones, where it was repaired and used in special events. In 1997, leaking boiler pipes caused the engine to break down. The engine was dismantled, with the steam boiler and firing oven being taken to the neighbouring Czech Republic for maintenance. A cost of around $15,000, £8,000, found the engine fully recovered and looking like new in December 1998. From Altena-Gelberg, both the main and side tracks run parallel for just over a mile, along a section of forest and fish ponds. In the earlier development days, new laws were enacted that helped lower costs for private builders. These included allowances for local railways to build narrow-gauge tracks with a smaller bend radii, an essential requirement considering the difficult terrain of the region. Signals were simplified, level crossings removed, and taxes on income were virtually eliminated. Even the mail could be carried free of charge. North of Altena-Gelberg, the tracks separate. Our track heads in a southwest direction towards Heidenreichstein. As the route passes through Landjäger forests, it ascends continuously to 547 meters above sea level. The new lightweight tracks and carriages meant challenging terrain could be more easily overcome. Narrow gauge railways had become the popular alternative for any side routes. Of course, there were downsides as well. Speed had to be kept to no more than 23 miles per hour, and capacity was extremely limited. But these kinds of disadvantages were not as significant for the region as the much bigger problems of transporting the goods onto the standard gauge state rail line further away. The most important of these normal gauge connections was the Franz Josefs Bahn Railway. Goods in transport had to be unloaded and then reloaded again. However, it was not long before a solution had been reached where a normal gauge wagon was fitted with rails to accommodate the narrow gauge tracks. The narrow gauge wagons could then be transferred via a ramp to be rolled into place on top of the normal gauge rolling stock. This mechanism also worked in reverse, where narrow gauge rolling stock carried the regular gauge tracks on them, enabling regular gauge stock to be transported over the narrow gauge routes. When the route was planned, it was important that forest areas be avoided as much as possible. Tree branches could easily block the tracks and damage telephone lines. This is exactly what happened on the first day of operation. The engineer on the early morning train from Wackelstein to Altena-Gelberg reported that at 3 miles into the journey, a tree had fallen near the track and damaged the phone lines. Fortunately, train 102 was only delayed for 3 minutes. Nevertheless, the rich forests are still the basis for the railway's existence. After the line was built, wood began to be transported in addition to the regular products. Since the Second World War, wood now makes up 90% of the railway's goods. The rise in wood prices is now reflected in the transportation costs. Considering the few staff of today, it is interesting to note that even before it opened in 1900, there were 182 labourers, 13 professionals, 2 horses and 2 steam engines employed by the line. The official opening was originally set for July 1st, 1900. However, because of setbacks from a very hard winter, it was postponed until the August. For those railway enthusiasts who love facts and figures, the route has a maximum ascent of 2%, with a minimum track radius of 80 metres. During its 15 months of construction, thousands of cubic metres of soil and 32,000 cubic metres of gravel were moved. The railway company applied for an increase in the maximum speed allowance from 15 miles per hour to 22 miles per hour. After several test runs, the authorities permitted the limit to be raised to 19 miles per hour, but only for 60% of the route. The remainder would have to be the original 15 mile per hour limit. Christine Ertl manages the restaurant car. She has to begin the day's preparations by shopping for local specialities, which will be sold later during the journey. Most of the food and beverages are donated, and as such, the profit earned on them goes directly into the Railway Association's budget. Passenger transport by rail declined during the 1960s, and a great many routes were closed. This meant rail carriage improvements proceeded at a slow pace. However, in 1979, railway enthusiasts began efforts to obtain a dining carriage for this route. They had spotted a coach with 2 axles, built in 1906 that became available following the closure of the side track. Financed by a brewery and a construction company, this carriage was adapted with kitchenette curtains, wooden tables, benches, and even a new colour. It proved so popular with the locals as well as foreign tourists that a second coach had to be adapted in 1984. After a distance of 4 miles and a half-mile long descent, the station of Langegg appears. The operation of privately owned local railways in 1900 required that they were always subject to government route revisions and operating permits. In those days, Austrian politics played a more dominant role than the economics. Langegg station required a loading platform for its continued operation. Because the railway company itself had no interest in financing one, the community of Langegg donated a platform and nearly financed a road as well. Langegg is the halfway point on the route, and it's essential to refill the water tank with the help of the local fire brigade. Water is supplied to the engine by a 20-metre long hose connected to a public hydrant. During filling, there is time to chat and exchange news. The passengers, being mainly tourists, are not in any hurry. The procedure of tank filling is actually quite a novelty these days. The tank holds 2,000 litres, and when the water pours out of the top, there's no doubt it's full.
So, bis zum nächsten Mal, gell?
Although originally intended for the transportation of goods, the line did have occasional passengers. Unfortunately, this was of minimum importance for the local residents, as the service was infrequent and ticket prices high. However, records of the time did show residents travelling by train, either to visit the doctor, the local authorities, or even occasionally travelling as a tourist, thus proving the fact that the prestige of having this route in the area was more psychological than economic. By 1900, the company had finally realised the advantages of people travel and were making efforts to attract more tourists. Advertisements were being posted stating that the region was an ideal and beautiful place for the Viennese vacation. Local communities hoped that this would be the beginning of an increase in income to the area. The railway opening did bring about greater mobility, as well as a new form of recreation to the locals. Various communities would organise group journeys to neighbouring towns, many of which had not been seen in years, as they'd been hard to reach due to lack of suitable transportation. The first special train trip departed at 12 noon. The fare for the journey was only 1 guilder, just a few pence back then, and people rushed to get the first available seat. More than 300 people would finally board to the accompaniment of a local band. There is no band today, but Bubby, a retired music teacher and member of the Railway Association, plays his accordion for the passengers every weekend. He and his music add a special flair to the journey. The train's rolling stock originally consisted of several freight wagons. These were 2-axle type units. 4-axle units were added later, though all of them were built from the copious wood available. As time went by, freight wagons became more sophisticated, often combining with mail and or conductor's compartment as well. Passenger carriages were kept at 2 axles, however. Third-class travel was extremely basic, being mainly comprised of wooden benches and glass lights. Windows were adjusted by simple leather belts. Upholstered second-class seats were far more comfortable. However, windows were traditional, and only bare light bulbs provided the lighting. Safety features were in the form of an emergency brake. Line maintenance today is undertaken by 2 powered trolleys and rail bicycles. The rivulet near Alfang passes under a concrete bridge, a new invention at that time. The bridge was successfully tested in June 1900 with the combined weight of 3 engines and 3 freight wagons. After a 7-mile journey, the train arrives at Alfang station. At the time of its building, only one small side track had been planned, but in the end 2 tracks were completed. A loading ramp and train controller's house were also built. Original wooden toilet houses have been found at Alfang, Altner-Gelberg and Heidenreichstein. The importance of these cannot be underestimated, as trains at this time had no toilets on board, a difficulty that remained until the 1960s. Here was the train controller's house. He was responsible for buildings and track maintenance over the entire 9-mile route, which he covered using a rail bicycle. Together with their wives, train controllers performed numerous station duties, selling tickets, controlling freight traffic, and in some stations, even operating a restaurant. In 1821, Viennese resident Joseph Kellner built a glass-making factory nearby. The business was later bought in 1852 by Stolzer. By 1891, the factory was employing 32 workers. 16 years later, and 7 years after the opening of the route, the factory had expanded to 74 employees. Unfortunately, in August 1914, the factory was closed down due to lack of workers and never reopened again. Passing through forests and fields, the railway continually climbs as it heads towards Heidenreichstein. A license to operate a railway in Austria was given by the state through a representative of the emperor. The license for the regional railway from Gmund to Litschau, with a side track to Heidenreichstein, was issued and published in 1898. Because of this link, the local railway received much preferential treatment from the regional railway. Even though it was favoured by the new law, the downside was that the emperor still had an influence over it. This meant that military officers could travel at reduced fare, and when the company wanted to hire new employees, preference had to be given to Marines and ex-officers of the armed forces. The operating licence was usually given for 90 years, but 2 world wars later had reduced the private railway operation by over 20. Then the state authorities took it over. Rounding a corner, the track is found to be broken at the outer bend. A temporary repair is made using some screw clamps. The advantage of narrow gauge is that the tracks are lighter and therefore easier to repair than regular tracks. The train has to slow, however, to ensure minimum disturbance of the clamps. Because of its private ownership, it was necessary to mark out the railroad's territory with boundary stones, some of which can still be seen today. Even after 50 years of state ownership, the letters NW can still be read. They stand for Niederösterreich Waldewertelbahn, which means the Lower Austrian Waldewertel Railway. The economy situation had made it necessary to support local industry. All materials for equipment, railway construction and engines had to be purchased locally. Exceptions were only made by the Railway Ministry where this was not practical. This railroad ministry also had influence over the freight fares on privately owned railways. If an economical or political emergency arose, such as rising food prices, the minister could force the fares to be lowered. A later legal amendment stated that Royal Mail staff and police with escorted inmates must also travel at reduced fares. For some reason, the train is extensively delayed when it arrives at Heidenreichstein. It has to steam slowly into the station and appears to be suffering loss of power. This could mean the end of the line in more sense than one, as any major repairs will be prohibitively expensive. During the First World War in 1918, there was still a regional operation. 2 trains ran on even days of the week, with a third being added on odd days. However, the lack of available coal due to the war was becoming obvious. The summer schedule for 1919 stated that only 1 train per day was operating. Then, in 1920, the schedule said simply that no trains were running at all. However, evidence suggests that some trains were operating during the 1920 period. It's possible that single train operations were made on short notice when coal donations were received. Operationally, it was imperative that an alternative fuel source was found. At the time, it was not clear whether steam engines could even be fired by the wood which was abundant in the area, but by June 1922, 2 trains per day were running. The end station, Heidenreichstein, is finally reached after 9 miles. The station has 4 tracks, providing for an original plan to continue the service into the neighbouring region. The Isert company at Heidenreichstein had financed and built a sidetrack to its own factory. Today there is a modern factory on this spot. The original tracks have been mostly dismantled, leaving only a small portion still extant. Between 1938 and 1945 there were no remarkable changes for the railway, except being taken under the control of the Nazi railway minister. Unfortunately, in 1945, the route was targeted for an attack by the Allies that killed 336 people, when 2,000 bombs were dropped on a munitions train. After the Communists took over Czechoslovakia in 1948, the Iron Curtain fell. The new border meant a change of route for the railway. The area gradually became a no-man's land, but this was only a small part of the economic difficulties that lay ahead. In the summer of 1986, passenger rail traffic from Gmünd to Lützow and Heidenreichstein was closed down. On our train, the suspicion is confirmed that there is engine damage. It must be pushed to the maintenance shed for evaluation. First, the water must be let out in order to determine where the problem lies. Fortunately, the engine driver is also the mechanic. In the bottom of the boiler, deposits of rust are found. They're normally spilt out with the water. This is a common procedure performed regularly during boiler maintenance. Now the thin smoke pipes have to be checked for clogging. This results in a large amount of soot being removed. All mechanical parts and instruments are checked as a matter of procedure. The coal grid is cleaned to show the state of the ash container. A piece of wire is used to check whether there has been any contamination between the water boiler and the heating box. It appears there may be a bigger problem than was first thought, because the decision is made to push the engine back into the shed. Although another steam engine has been purchased, it's not yet ready for operation, and a diesel locomotive will have to continue the route. The other new engine originated in a Romanian metal company. Because the factory had not used it for a considerable number of years, the engine had sunk deeply into mud to just above its axles. In addition to the locomotive, the association had also managed to get hold of spare parts, seen here being dismantled by volunteer Siegfried Roth. Siegfried Roth is normally a computer specialist at the local hospital. He's also responsible for financial matters within the association, as well as serving as an engine driver. It is clear to see by the uneven surface that the engine was extensively used, although never maintained properly. The wheel track gauging was also heavily damaged, and it is fortunate that spare axles were also delivered. 2 cylinders in bad condition were also included amongst the spare parts. The diesel engine will have to substitute for the steam loco during its period of repair. Before embarking, the diesel engine has its track gauge checked carefully. The diesel engine, number DM100H14, was built in 1969 by an Austrian company. It has a water-cooled 2-cylinder 100 horsepower diesel engine driving a mechanical 4-speed hydraulically supported gearbox. Motive power is through a chain to both axles. The brakes and horn are operated by compressed air. For such a small locomotive, its weight of 14 tons is quite a surprise. Unlike its darker colleague, it does have warm water heating. In spite of all the problems that the Railway Association is facing, the members are optimistic about the future. The telephone line has been reinstalled along the track for emergency and damaged situations. Information and communication points every 500 metres are now being considered. A good sign is that this will not be done by modern mobile telephones, but rather by people wanting to restore an historic local system. It's important to preserve the Wackelstein Express for future generations.